Red Bull just had a massive event for Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. We've got the names and some information about all of the different weapon categories, new spells, incantations, the new leveling mechanic, and more. I'm going to go through all of this as spoiler-free as possible. Let's go! Let me know what weapon type of these you like the best. Also, this footage comes from the Red Bull event and Elijah's, so all credit goes to them. Links will be in the description. But let's start with the leveling mechanic. So at the very start of the presentation, we got about like half hour or so of gameplay from a Bandai Namco employee, and they showed a fair few sort of the interesting like opening hours of the DLC, as well as the new leveling mechanic, which is what I wanted to touch on here because I think it's the most interesting thing about what they showed, to be honest. Now, this is the Scatter Tree Blessing. Now, the fun fact about this is that it only works in the realm of Shadow. Now, the description that pops up reads that it can be found across the realm of Shadow, and it consumes these at sites of grace to bolster your Scatter Tree Blessing. And the Scatter Tree Blessing bolsters the recipient's abilities to deal and negate damage, but it has no influence outside the realm of Shadow. Now, at a site of grace, there is this new Shadow Realm Blessing option where you can actually use to consume these to get the buff. Interestingly, briefly, we do see it pop up that there is the Revered Spirit Ash Blessing as well. So essentially, this assumedly is exactly the same for your Spirit Ashes as well. So if you are going to be using summons in the DLC, they'll also get a buff as well in the realm of Shadow. Now, these seem to be located just throughout like the game world. Like we'll obviously be finding these at these various sites of Miquella's footsteps, like the runes that we do see throughout this sort of opening of the DLC, and that we've seen a lot of imagery throughout all of the trailers. I'm really curious how many of these are in the DLC, and if like they are actually needed to progress through the DLC, if they're just sort of like an added leveling mechanic. I'm a little disappointed that they don't have any influence outside the realm of Shadow. Like in a way, you know, it's good to give you a different sense of progression throughout, but it's also a little sad that you can't take these outside of the realm of Shadow, right? They don't really do anything, but you know, neither here nor there, right? At least the main thing is that all the weapons you'll be able to take throughout the rest of the game. And speaking of those weapons, let's go through the weapon categories, starting with my personal favorite, the Light Greatsword, and Milady, the weapon that we saw in this category. Now, this is a sort of, I guess it's a hybrid between like a typical sort of like longsword weapon and like the great swords, right? Like we see the basic attack combos with this weapon are very thrusting based, but definitely a faster combo patterns than compared to a traditional great sword. And the Ash of War is really interesting here, called Wing Stance, where you flick the weapon out to your side and then follow up in a kind of double slash like animation. Obviously it's a little different here, but it's a good way to think about it, right? But it definitely looks very cool, and you've got the B dex scaling into keen for this weapon as well. So this is obviously set as a keen Milady, which is clearly a bit of a pun that they're trying to play there.
You may not know that I play the mandolin as well. Okay, air mandolin.
As with all of these weapons, when we go through them, I wouldn't draw too much on the specifics of their scalings, right? Like, you know, we do know there's going to be tons of these new weapons, and weapons often have different scaling even in the same categories, right? So if you're looking at this and you think, oh, it's dex, right? You know, I wish there was strength, right? The chances are there's probably going to be a strength light greatsword, right? So don't read too much into the scalings here. It's just worth calling out for the weapons that they did actually use. Next is the Backhand Blade. This is probably my favorite, being a dex primary weapon user, especially like loving the two-hand dex build. Interestingly, for the backhand blades, right, they are like those scimitars that you do hold like in a back grip. They operate very similar to fist weapons in the main game, where you only need one of these weapons, and then when you like power stance it to hand it, you pull out the second one. So you don't actually need to find two backhand blades in order to like do the power stancing stuff. Now, it does have an Ash of War called Blind Spot, which is basically like Bloodhound Step with a follow-up attack. Like, this is going to be really interesting to see the PvP implications of something like this, especially because being able to dodge attacks in such a way and then follow up, like, going to be a lot of balancing about Blind Spot, I definitely think. But it looks really cool. Really like the overall flow of these weapons, and like the attack patterns look really great. I'm definitely keen to make some sort of a status build with the backhand blades. Hand to hand in a similar way is something that I would be interested in making a build about. The weapon that we see here is called Dryleaf Arts in this hand to hand category, and the Ash of War is called Dryleaf Whirlwind, which is the one that we saw from the trailers where you like jump in the air and do like this kick animation animation. Then the basic attacks are just sort of like kicking and punching, sort of typical, monk-like animations here. Interestingly, the attribute requirements for this hand weapon is very low, being 8 strength and 8 dex. It does scale primarily with dex, however, but it is marked as keen, so I wouldn't read into that again. What's interesting about this weapon is that it is a plus 25, so it's not a unique weapon, right? Like it's not using somber smithing stones to level up, but it does have essentially a unique name and a unique Ash of War. Will be interesting to see with the rest of these hand-to-hand weapons if they fit in similar categories, how exactly they work. Like, do they all just have unique Ash of Wars on them, right? Like, there's a lot of questions to be had with the hand-to-hand category, but you can see that they look like a ton of fun and will be a lot of fun to play around with. Just like these fully sick beast claws. Now, on the topic of somber smithing stones, this is a plus 10, so this would be a somber smithing stone weapon. So it is a unique weapon here. These bear claws, these red bear claws, excuse me, and the Ash of War red bear hunt. Now, these are in the beast claw categories. One may assume there may be others in this category, but they also have blood loss build up on them, and they do primarily scale with strength. I am curious just personally if, like, say hand to hand is maybe more dex focused and beast claw is maybe more strength focused, or if I'm reading into that too much, but I'm very interested to see more of these weapons. We didn't get a huge amount of gameplay with the beast claws. Like, there was only a tiny little bit that, like, throughout this whole demonstration, but it does seem like these will be quite an interesting weapon. I wonder if there's going to be, more beast claws you can gather specific to certain, like, rune bears or bear type enemies that you may be able to get these from. But look very cool. We didn't see heaps of them, so there's not too much to say, but definitely keen to check these out a bit more. The perfume bottles, however, are one of the most annoying things in the main game, and now we can actually do that ourselves. So we see the Fire Spark perfume bottles in the preview. Now, these deal exclusively fire damage and scale exclusively with dex. What's interesting about this is that they don't consume any FP when you actually use them, right, in those fire attacks. It's just basically like normal attack combinations. Also, the Ash of War here is kick, so I wonder if you can put different Ash of Wars on this weapon, or if it's just going to be like kick essentially as the Ash of War. Something that was mentioned in a lot of the other creators, like early previews as well, if you're wondering, is that even though this perfume bottle does fire damage specifically, there will be other perfume bottles that deal the other different types of damage, right, like magic, lightning, etc. So they're not going to be exclusively fire damage from what we've seen or heard, but it's just worth pointing out that that's the ones that we saw in this specific preview. The thrusting shield is an interesting one. This is a shield that is also a weapon. Like, you'll use the spikes on the either end to actually attack with enemies. It operates as sort of like a weapon, and the version that we see of the thrusting shield, the dueling shield, scales with dex primarily and has shield strike as its Ash of War. What I'm really interested about this weapon, guys, if you can let me know if you have any interest in shields in the comments. Like, maybe it's just me, but I don't really, this is the one category that I'm just like, like, I'm not super interested in. All the other ones I'm like, oh, I can't wait to play around with this, I can't wait to do this. And this one I'm like, a shield. Like, do you know what I mean? I'm not trying to be ungrateful. New weapons and stuff, super cool, really keen to check them out, but the thrusting shield just isn't for me. So I'm curious to know what you guys think, if maybe I'm in a minority here. Anyway, we'll move on to the Great Katana, one that I am absolutely a fan of because I do love my katanas in Elden Ring. Now, the Great Katana example that we do see does have blood loss buildup, like every good katana does. And it has overhead stance, which is a new Ash of War where you pull the Great Katana above your head and then, like, slam it down on enemies, and lots of, like, slashing attacks here. I'm very curious about the reach of the Great Katana. Is it more than the Nagakiba? Like what that actual reach is going to be worth? Like, is it really worthwhile having a Great Katana specifically for, say, the reach or like the damage? Like, I'm just curious about those damage numbers, right? Like, the Nagakiba is kind of like a Great Katana in its own way. Just curious about how that sort of reads, and once we get our hands on it, we'll be able to compare them ourselves. But I do really like the animations on the Great Katana, especially that overhead stance does look like a really sick Ash of War. Obviously, blood loss buildup is obviously fantastic on this sort of weapon as well, so plenty to play around with for all of you dex users out there. Smith script is the next category. Now, this is a bit strange. So this is counted as a weapon category, but it's kind of like a subcategory, because essentially what this is your typical weapon categories, right? There are 3 examples that were shown: a great hammer, a spear, an axe, and daggers, actually. So there's 4 examples shown. Now, these all are essentially like normal weapon categories, except they have the Smith script in their weapon title, and that means that their charged R2 will throw the weapon. I think this is different with the daggers, as that does seem to be just like their typical attack animation, so it might be different depending on the type of weapon. But essentially here, you've got your normal like attack patterns, and then you put your Ash of War, whatever it may be, onto it, right? It can be anything that you would typically typically expect from that weapon category. And then the charged R2 is the like throwing of that weapon. So they are a little different in that way. It also seems like these have some scaling with intelligence and faith, which is interesting thing to note. Like the daggers have it as well as the great hammer. Very light scaling. Very curious about that. Like, is this sort of a weapon that maybe you'll be using in your, say, main hand with sort of like battle mage vibes? So say you've got another option in case you don't want to cast spells, like you can throw that as a ranged weapon. I'm just really interested to see more about this category. Like, it's definitely the most interesting and unique, but it doesn't fit within like the typical what we would consider a weapon category in Elden Ring or anything like that. It seems to be its own subcategory just with anything that has that Smith script title. Also wonder if like, you know, there are Smith script weapons for like every category, right? There's a lot of categories in Elden Ring. Just wondering it's more specifics about that. Really interesting though. Love to know your thoughts on it in the comments down below. And if you are wondering as well, we did see weapons that fit within existing categories. Like we saw the Fire Knight's Greatsword, which is a colossal sword, and has the Flame Spear, Ash of War, which is kind of like a fire version of the Impaling Thrust specifically for this weapon. And we also saw some other like unique Ash of Wars as well, like the aspect of the Crucible Wings, which, fun fact, that's actually a Ash of War rather than an incantation, as well as a couple of other ones that we saw in Elijah's streams as well, like the Spinning Grab Thrust and the Poison Flower Blooms Twice. Plenty of really interesting stuff that we're going to get from the DLC for sure, and to play around with and make builds from. Even in the spells and incantations categories, right? We didn't see a ton of like specifics about these. We saw a couple of new spells in Gravitational Missile and Glintstone Nail and Nails, Miriam's Vanishing, which is like Bloodhound Step for mages basically, and some new incantations like the Roar of Rugali, which we did see in the trailers as well, the Divine Bird Feathers, which looks like an amazing spammable incantation, Knight's Lightning Spear, and aspects of the Crucible Bloom. But there wasn't, just to me personally, I didn't think we saw enough of those to sort of give much of a detailed explanation of them because we didn't see any of their real item descriptions and stuff. But I just thought I'd call it out at the end of this video here to say like we did actually see them. So if you are in those categories of, you know, spells and incantations users, like typically myself, you will be getting new ones as well, but we'll have to wait for the actual DLC to check that out, which is coming this week. So it's very exciting to see. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments down below. I'll have a ton more videos coming out when the DLC does come out for the DLC. So be sure to, you know, subscribe and do all that good stuff. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.